Well, thank you. And yes, my name is Hugh. I'm in recovery. I'm a thinkaholic. And I'm glad to hear, Darren, that you're also a thinkaholic. And guess what? Every human being is a thinkaholic. And so when it tells us to worship the Lord our God with all of our mind, that's every one of us here. Now, we're going to have a Q&A time after my message this morning. Also, we'll do that this evening. But I do take questions on my Facebook and Twitter page. So if you don't get to ask your question today, feel free to engage me on Facebook and Twitter. It's real easy. Just put in Hugh Ross Facebook, Hugh Ross Twitter. It'll come right up. And yes, go to our website. I was told there's 40,000 articles and video clips on our website. So take your time to go through them. And you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you'll be notified of all the latest videos we put up there. And go to YouTube and put my name in, and you'll be able to watch several debates I've done with some of the world's leading atheist scientists. But as mentioned, we are giving away this book. It's my latest book, my 22nd book, Rescuing Inerrancy. And if you scan that QR code, we'll make sure you get a free copy of that book. And what I'm going to be speaking on is helping to launch the series you're going to be doing here on the verse 11 chapters of Genesis. And I wrote this book, Navigating Genesis, which takes you through the first 11 chapters of Genesis. You can get a free copy at reasons.org/Ross. But what I'm going to do this morning is focus on the first page of the Bible. And many people lose their faith when they read the Bible's first page. For me, I was not raised in a Christian home, didn't really know any Christians growing up. That's because I didn't grow up here in Tennessee. I grew up in Canada. They're hard to find in Canada, not so hard to find here in Tennessee. But for me, reading the Bible's first page during my late teenage years was a huge step in making Jesus my master and my Savior. And what it tells us in Psalms and Job is that the more we learn about nature, the more evidence we uncover for the supernatural handiwork of God. So what I want to do is demonstrate how we can put Genesis to the test with the latest scientific discoveries. Now, I've found no matter where I travel in the world, everybody knows Genesis 1:1. Maybe not John 3:16, but they know Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I remember reading that at age 17 for the first time and said, what is this heavens and earth? Reading through the Old Testament, I never found the word universe. There is no word in biblical Hebrew for the universe. However, they have this phrase, the heavens and the earth. It's used 13 times in the Old Testament. Every time it refers to the entirety of physical reality, all matter, energy, space, and time. So the very first sentence of the Bible is telling us there's a beginning to the universe. The universe is a created entity. Now, I was reading the Bible at the same time that physicists in South Africa and Britain were developing the first of the space-time theorems. Today, we've got 30 of those space-time theorems. But what they all state is, if the universe contains mass, and every one of you is living proof that it indeed does contain mass, and if general relativity reliably describes the movements of bodies in the universe, which today we can prove to 17 places of the decimal, then space and time must have a beginning. Space and time must be created. And the most famous of these space-time theorems, one of the authors, Alexander Vilenkin, he's a Russian agnostic astronomer. A year and a half after publishing his famous theorem, he made this statement. He says, quote, with the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. We have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. And what is that problem? Proof of a space-time beginning implies a causal agent beyond space and time who creates their universe of space-time, matter, and energy. And I told people in the first service that I was speaking at a NASA research facility, and the director came up to me and said, you can't use the word God here at this facility. I said, well, that's going to be tough given the talk I've been asked to speak on. Is it okay if I talk about the causal agent beyond space and time who created the universe and designed it for the benefit of us human beings? He said, yeah, you can do that. So, but here we see, just in the very first sentence of the Bible, in light of the latest scientific discoveries, a miracle-working God must exist. I mean, I run into scientists who are atheists and they say, I want to see scientific proof of a miracle. I said, well, what bigger miracle could you ask for than the coming into existence of all matter, energy, space, and time? And we can now prove that beyond any rational doubt. In fact, I got a collection of books written by atheist scientists. The latest ones are all conceding deism. They say, yes, we cannot take deism off the scientific table. There has to be an agent beyond space and time. Well, my wife, when we first met, said, you can't really have 30 points in a 30-minute talk. This isn't Caltech. You got to break it down to just 3 points. And that was a real struggle for me this morning, but I got it down to just these 3 points for the remainder of my talk. Point 1, we're going to talk about the frame of reference or the point of view for the creation days in Genesis 1, the meaning of the word day, and then I'm going to spend most of the time taking you through the order of creation events in Genesis 1 and the description of those events and see how they square with the latest scientific discoveries. Well, as you move into Genesis 1-2, what you need to recognize is the frame of reference changes. The point of view for Genesis 1:1 is the universe. But when you get to Genesis 1:2, God speaks. He says that the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. The frame of reference has now been changed from the universe to the surface of planet Earth, below the clouds, not above the clouds. Now, you actually get more scientific detail on creation in the book of Job. The book of Job is older than the book of Genesis by 400 or 500 years. And there's a reason why Moses in Genesis 1 at times can be so brief, because Job explains it in much more detail. And when you get in the book of Job concerning the frame of reference, Job 38:9, God speaks, I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness. Now, Genesis 1:2 not only gives you the frame of reference, it gives you the 4 initial conditions. Water covers the whole surface of the earth. It's dark everywhere on the surface of the waters, and the world is empty of life and unfit for life. It's formless and void. But then the Spirit of God begins to work. So the reason why it's dark on the surface of the waters, not because there isn't light. There was light when God created the universe. It's dark because the clouds were opaque to light. So remember nothing else from my talk this morning. Remember this. The point of view for the 6 creation days is the surface of Earth's oceans. And when you run into skeptics that say, hey, I'm a scientist, everything that Genesis 1 teaches is scientific nonsense. Ask them, well, from what point of view are you interpreting the text? And what I've noticed from these skeptics, they're thinking the point of view is God above the earth telling us what's happening on the earth. Genesis 1:2 says no, it's God on the surface of the waters telling us what's happening from that perspective. If you put the point of view above the earth, indeed Genesis 1 teaches nothing but scientific nonsense. But put the frame of reference on the surface of the earth, as you will see, it's a perfect fit with the established scientific record. And it was Galileo who said the biggest mistake you can make in Bible interpretation is to get the wrong point of view. So remember this. Now, some of you are capable of remembering 2 things. So here's the second thing I want you to remember. The word yom, translated day from the Hebrew, has 4 distinct literal definitions. I mean, the pastor introduced to me talked about how some think the days are 24 hours, some think they're long periods of time. It's a debate between two distinct literal definitions. Both are literal. 4 literal definitions. Part of the daylight hours, all of the daylight hours, 1 calendar day at 24 hours, or a long but finite period of time. Now, when I was 17 reading this for the first time, I realized, without any knowledge of Hebrew, this word day must have at least 3 distinct literal definitions, because 3 are used on the first page. So when you get to creation day 1, it's using day for the daylight hours. Creation day 4, it's contrasting seasons, days, and years. That's day is 24 hours. But Genesis 2:4 uses the same word day to refer to the entirety of creation history. That's day as a long period of time. The other thing I notice at age 17 is that the first 6 days end with an evening-morning phrase. Evening was, morning was, day 3, 4, 5. And again, not knowing what the Hebrew words for evening and morning were, I knew at least what they were saying is each day has a start time, each day has an end time, which means the days must be consecutive. And so day 3 ends where day 4 begins, beginning and ending. But then you get to day 7. There's no evening-morning phrase, which implies it's not yet finished. And when you read on in the Bible, you discover 2 passages, Psalm 95 and Hebrews 4, that state that we're still in God's 7th day. And it's the day when God stops creating. For 6 days God creates. On the 7th day he rests from creating. It's the principle of the Sabbath. We work 6 days. What do we do in the 7th day? We focus on the most important issues of life. That's what this whole service is all about, taking time to focus on the most important issues of life. For 6 days God creates. On the 7th day he redeems. In fact, you'll find passages in the Bible that state that before God created anything, he began his works of redemption, which implies that everything that God creates is for the purpose of redemption. That's what God's doing today. But I remember reading this, and I said, finally, an answer to the fossil record enigma. Now, I was one of these nerdy kids. When I was 7 years of age, I was reading 4 or 5 books on physics and astronomy, and I was doing that every week. And my parents thought I was obsessive about physics and astronomy. I didn't think so, but they did. And they said, we got to get Hugh reading something besides physics and astronomy. And they knew it had to be science. So when I was 11, they bought our family a big, thick book of evolutionary biology. I was the only one in the family that read it. But I remember telling my parents, the numbers don't work. We have all these new phyla and classes and orders and families of life before humanity, and none of that happens after humanity. And so that's what you see in the fossil record. New phyla, classes, and orders before humans begin, but none whatsoever afterwards. And I said, finally, an answer to the fossil record enigma. We see no orders or classes or phyla coming into existence in the human era because God is not creating. We see it before humans because that's when God creates. It also explains why so many biologists say we see no evidence, scientific evidence for God. They're looking on the wrong day. If they're doing their research in the human era, they will not see that evidence. Explains why so many astronomers are believers, because our data comes from the past. And so we get to see into the 6 days and see God's miraculous handiwork everywhere. A matter of days. Pastor here mentioned it. I basically made the point. There are over 24 lengthy creation texts in the Bible, most of them outside the book of Genesis. God gave us 66 books. We're to read all of them consistently. And so when you look at those creation texts and interpret them literally and consistently, you recognize that the days of creation in Genesis 1 must be 6 consecutive long periods of time. You can get a free chapter at reasons.org/Ross. Well, let's jump into point 3, the creation events. And creation day 1, it says, let there be light. Notice it doesn't say that God created the light or made the light. It says, let the light be. God created the light when he created the universe, but it was dark on the surface of the waters until creation day 1. What did God do in creation day 1? He transformed our thick, opaque atmosphere into a thin atmosphere that light from the sun, moon, and stars come through, illuminate the surface of the earth, and that light would now permit life to exist. So when it says the Spirit of God was brooding over the surface of the waters, this is when God brought life for the first time on the surface of the waters. And then we move into creation day 2. And Moses here is very cryptic. All he says is water above and water below. He could afford to be cryptic because in the book of Job, you got 1.5 chapters devoted to God's activities on creation day 2. So what you see in Job 37 and 38 is an explanation of how God established a complex water cycle, water above and water below, where the water circulates from below to above and above to below. And you look at the book of Job, it describes how God set up this water cycle with 3 different kinds of liquid precipitation, rain, mist, and dew, and 3 different kinds of frozen precipitation, snow, frost, and hail. I remember reading that during my teenage years and saying, this explains why we can have billions of people on the face of the earth and all of our animals, with all these different kinds of precipitation actually existing everywhere in the world. The amazing thing of our planet Earth, even at the equator, you got frozen precipitation, you got hail, you got glaciers on the high mountains, and this provides the water we need to be able to feed billions of people and all of our animals. One of the properties of frozen precipitation, it melts very slowly. And so this explains why we have rivers and streams that flow throughout the entire year. Yes, you got the rainfall, which provides the water, but because the snow and the ice melt slowly, that provides water when you don't have the rain and enables us to grow an abundance of food. Then we get into creation day 3. It says, let dry ground appear. And this is when God transforms our planet from a water world to where we now have oceans and continents that coexist. Now, when I was reading that for the first time, the geology textbooks were saying the continents have always been here. I mean, this was a story that they were saying about the continents on the face of the earth. But I noticed that these textbooks gave no scientific reason for that statement. It was simply an assumption. Then I get into the University of British Columbia as a physics student. And when I was a sophomore, 2 of the 3 physicists that launched the discipline of plate tectonics, they were at our university and they said, we want to teach a course on plate tectonics. First time it ever been done anywhere in the world. And all these graduate students were trying to jam into the class. Somehow I managed to get myself as a sophomore undergraduate into that class. And what I saw in that class was this story of the continental history of the earth. That because of plate tectonics, you get more and more coverage of the surface of the earth with land masses. But I remember going up to one of the professors after his lecture and said, I noticed you have it beginning at 7%. Is it possible it could start at 0%? And he says, well, yes, it could be anywhere from 0 to 10. We really don't know. I said, well, maybe the Bible got it right, that it really does start off at 0. Okay, go forward 40 years, year 2000, and thanks to detailed seismology studies, we begin to get a reliable picture of the growth of the continental land masses, where indeed it starts off as a water world, tiny volcanic islands. Then plate tectonics kicks in, and at the first great oxygenation event, we got a sudden burst of the growth of the continents. And what I noted back then is, okay, the most aggressive growth of the continents happens when the earth is a little bit less than half of its present age. Where does Genesis put it? The beginning of creation day 3. It says, we got a perfect fit here. Well, flash forward to the year 2018. This is when we discovered the details of what's called the deep oxygen cycle and how that bursts oxygen in the atmosphere, but also causes a dramatic jump in the continental land masses. And what this is demonstrating is that the more we learn about the past physics of the continents of the earth, the tighter and tighter fit we get with what Genesis taught thousands of years ago. Demonstrating the principle in Job and Psalms. The more we learn about nature, the more evidence we get for God's supernatural handiwork, the more evidence we get that every word of the Bible is accurate and true. And hey, if you want to read about this, I put out a weekly blog called Today's New Reason to Believe, and the one I wrote back in June 11th, 2018, talks about how this was all discovered and written for lay people. And so it's all on our website. You can check it out and see the evidence. And of course, we give you links to the actual scientific research papers. But God's not done on creation day 3. He says, once the continents are in place, let vegetation proliferate over the continents. Now, I've debated the executive director of the Skeptic Society 4 times on 4 different university campuses. And I remember in the first 2 of those debates, Michael Shermer would say, this is where the Bible gets it dead wrong. The fossil record tells us we get animals in the oceans before we get any vegetation on the continents. And I remember responding to him saying, well, I'm not surprised. Animals have bones, skeletons, and shells. Their fossils are going to be preserved for a long period of time. That won't be the case with vegetation, especially for the initial vegetation. It will decay and leave no discoverable remains. But what happened in 2009, a paper was published in Nature where it said we don't have the fossils, but we got the isotope signatures demonstrating that vegetation was abundant on the continents for 200 million years before the first appearance of animals on the face of the earth. Then in 2011, another paper got published where he said, we finally found the fossils. Well, they found fossil parts. The biggest part they found was 1 millimeter in diameter. But those fossils demonstrated that the continents had abundant vegetation for 600 million years before the first appearance of animals in the ocean. Then we get to creation day 4. And it says, let there be lights in the sky. And this is the first time that creatures on the surface of the earth could actually see the sun, moon, and stars in the sky. And it explains this. Let there be lights in the sky so they may serve to mark seasons, days, and years. Now, in creation day 5 is when God creates the first animals. The plants don't need to know where the sun, moon, and stars are in the sky, but the animals do. Every animal species needs to know the positions of the sun, moon, and stars in the sky to regulate their biological clocks. And just a few years ago, a team of physicists discovered what it was that transformed Earth's atmosphere from being a thick haze to being transparent, where you can now see the sun, moon, and stars in the sky. It happened as a result of the second great oxygenation event. And this is where oxygen in the atmosphere went from less than 1% and suddenly jumped up to 8%. Those of you who have taken geology courses may have heard of the Great Unconformity. The Great Unconformity was massive worldwide landslides where stuff came off the continents into the oceans. It had the effect of accelerating the deep oxygen cycle, and suddenly the oxygen went from 1% up to 8% very suddenly. And what this team of physicists did, they made this big flask and filled it with the known atmospheric components of Earth's atmosphere, and then they added oxygen step by step by step to see what happened. At 1%, they couldn't even see through the flask. It was so hazy. But then as they added oxygen, things began to clear. I'll give you an analogy. Here's a photograph of a mountain in Colorado that's a half kilometer away. And this is what it would look like if you've got 2% oxygen in the atmosphere. The haze is so thick, you can't see anything beyond about 100 feet. But as you jump the oxygen content up to 4%, you begin to make out something through the haze. And then as the oxygen goes from 4% to 5%, you get to see, oh, yeah, I can tell it's a mountain. And the haze gradually clears, and by the time it gets to 8%, you can see something in the sky near the mountain that you could never see before. The moon shows up. And hey, you can read about this in another Today's New Reason to Believe article, June 18th, 2018. So, hey, if you got a skeptical friend, take him to Today's New Reason to Believe. Literally every day, science research papers are published that make a stronger case for the Christian faith than we had the day before. If I had the time, I could write 12 such articles literally every day. That's what's happening in the scientific literature. Creation Day 5. Let the waters teem with living creatures. And this was when animals first show up on the face of the earth. And you can't have animals until you got at least 8% oxygen in the atmosphere. But the moment it hits 8%, suddenly you got animals. And so we notice is that the fossil record actually reveals the opposite of what naturalistic or theistic evolutionary models predict. Those models tell us that here's how life evolves. You have species, and the proliferation of species, if you wait long enough, will make a new genus. And if you wait long enough, new genera will produce new families. New families will produce new orders. New orders will produce new classes. Last of all, you get the phylum. And my wife reminded me, you need to tell them what a phylum is. I just assumed everybody knew. A phylum is a basic body plan. And to give you an example, all creatures with a backbone are part of the chordate phylum. And so we're all part of the chordate phylum. By the way, any animal that has a long neural cord is part of the chordate phylum. So it includes all the vertebrates, and a lot of the invertebrates are part of the chordate phylum. But at the Cambrian explosion, the beginning of the Cambrian explosion, more than 50 basic body plans suddenly appear. And they all appear suddenly, immediately, and simultaneously. New phyla appear first, not last. They appear simultaneously and suddenly. They appear as soon as physical and chemical conditions permit their existence. So, for example, we get the Avalon explosion of life. These are animals that don't have a digestive tract or circulatory system. They're filter feeders. You need at least 8% oxygen for those animals to exist, but the moment the oxygen hits 8%, you get this proliferation of phyla that can take advantage of that 8% oxygen. And then they go extinct and are replaced by the Cambrian explosion of phyla. And this is where you get more than 50 different body plans showing up at once. That happens when the oxygen jumps from 8% to 10%. And so this is what the oxygenation history looks like. But again, the moment it hits 10%, you immediately have these animals. And I remember reading the old textbooks where they said, yeah, these 50 phyla are stretched out over 50 million years. We now know that's incorrect. They all show up at the very beginning of the Cambrian event. The moment it hits 10%, they're all there. And this is what James Valentine and his colleagues, our nation's most famous paleontologist, says. He identifies himself as an atheist, but this is what he wrote in a scientific paper. The diversification of phyla occurs before that of classes, classes before that of orders, and orders before that of families. And the emphasis is in his article. And his point is, if it's naturalistic, you're going to get the species first and the phyla last, but it's the exact opposite of what we see. And he's not alone. Every paleontologist who has researched the Avalon and Cambrian explosions agrees with him. So, for example, we got Gregory Ray saying this: the Cambrian explosion of body plans poses an outstanding problem for macroevolution. Or Kevin Peterson said, elucidating the materialistic basis for the Cambrian explosion has become more elusive, not less, the more we know about the event itself. Now, as you move on to Creation Day 5, it talks about God creating soulish animals, animals that are not only physical, but soulish, endowed with mind, will, and emotions, and how God equipped them to form relationships with a higher species. Then he talks about God creating human beings. We're the same way. We're body and soul and spirit, and because of our spirit nature, we can form relationship with a higher being. God designed the birds and mammals to serve and please us and to relate to us. He designed us humans to serve and please him and relate to him. And have you ever noticed these birds and mammals will often run away from us? It's our sin and our abuse that causes them to run away instead of coming towards us. Have you ever gone to a really wild place where animals have never been abused by humans? They come towards you. They want to relate to you. In the same way, it's our sin that causes us to run away from God instead of towards God. Well, here's the bottom line. As you go through Genesis 1, and once you appreciate that the length of the creation days is an epoch of time rather than 24 hours, and the frame of reference is the surface of the earth, the scientific accuracy of the stated creation events is 10 for 10. And the Bible gets a perfect score on the initial conditions, 4 for 4. And not only does it put all the events in the correct order, it correctly describes all 10 of those events. Now, before I read the Bible, I went through the holy books of the other religions of the world, the Hindu Vedas, the Quran. I went through the Buddhist commentaries, Zoroastrianism. The best I found outside of the Bible for the account of creation was the Enuma Elish of the ancient Babylonians. They get 2 out of 14 right. What about the rest of them? They get a score of 0. The Bible alone gets a perfect score. And that was a major step in my giving my life to Jesus Christ, signing my name on the back of a Gideon Bible that was given to me in a public school, committing Jesus to be my master, my Lord, and my Savior. You can read more at Navigating Genesis. And hey, scan that QR code. We'll get you a free copy of my latest book, Rescuing Inerrancy. But here's the bottom line. The more we learn about nature, the more we learn from the frontiers of science, the more reasons we gain to believe the Bible, all 66 books, is God's Word, inspired and inerrant in everything that it addresses. Okay, we're going to take questions, and you can ask me a question on any subject. It doesn't have to be what we discussed this morning. I have only one rule for the Q&A time: no softball questions. We want hardball questions. Okay, anyone?
So, immediately. And remember, this is not a time for a soliloquy, just a question.
I found your explanation fascinating, and I was just curious. It's kind of a chicken and the egg question. Do you believe that God designed the laws of physics and then went through the days, or as he created the days, the law came into existence?
Yeah, good question. 7 places in the Bible it tells us that the laws of physics are immutable. They haven't changed. Probably the best example is Jeremiah 33, where God is speaking to the Jews and say, you change your mind all the time, but I'm a God that doesn't change. As proof, look to the laws that govern the heavens and the earth. As they have never changed, I have never changed. So when God created the universe, he established the laws of physics. And we're told in the book of Romans, chapter 8, those laws of physics will remain in effect until the full number of humans that God intends to redeem have been redeemed. Those laws of physics are predominantly in place to be tools for God to permanently eradicate evil. And when evil is eradicated, there will no longer be a need for gravity or electromagnetism or thermodynamics. And God's going to replace this universe with a brand new creation. A unique feature of Christianity, it's a 2 creation model, not a 1 creation model. He creates the universe to eradicate evil. When evil is eradicated, he will take the redeemed into the new creation. Read the last 2 chapters of the Bible, you'll discover it's a realm where nothing decays and nothing dies because there's no thermodynamics. There's no gravity to cause your chin to sag as you get older. There will be no gravity there. There will be no electromagnetism that will cause your skin to wrinkle over time. It's going to be new laws of physics and new dimensions. And the wonderful thing is, we'll no longer be constrained to linear time. God's going to deliver us into geometric time. What does that mean? We're going to be able to have intimate, one-on-one relationships with one another simultaneously with billions of other individuals and the angels and God himself. I can't wait to get there. And we'll get there as soon as we bring that full number of humans into a redeemed state.
Hi, Mr. Ross. I've been listening to you since I was a little kid. My dad turned me on to your podcast, so this is really cool and an honor. So this question I've had for a while, and I guess it's fate that I get to pose it to you now. It's more of a theological question. Does or ought old earth creationism change our perceptions of who God is? Consider the typical Christian narrative that God created something perfect in the beginning, yet we fell away and introduced imperfection into the system. Whereas old earth creationism would posit God more as a scientist and an inventor that through life or trial and error, countless deaths, he arrives eventually at man.
Yeah. A good quick response is Jesus' words at the end of John 16, where he shares with his disciples, in this world you'll have tribulation, but take heart, I've overcome the world. As a physicist, I like to paraphrase that. In this world you'll have thermodynamics, but take heart, I've overcome thermodynamics. He's basically making the point, we need that tribulation now. It's that tribulation where we gain eternal security. Keep in mind, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden did not have an eternally secure relationship with God. Now, God created in order to have strong love relationships with us. That meant he had to give us strong free will. In order to get eternal security, that strong free will had to be put to a test. And to be really secure, you got to put it to the greatest test possible. So what did God do? He invited Satan to come into the Garden of Eden. God could have easily kept Satan away from planet Earth for all of eternity. But he knew it was for our eternal benefit that we be exposed to Satan, be tested by the evil that he would introduce, and we would learn the lesson. We can't overcome it without God's help. But God is prepared to do for us what we can't do for ourselves. And so we're temporarily exposed to the laws of physics. We're temporarily exposed to suffering, but a time will come when we'll be delivered. And I know I've been both a professor and a student. When I take a role as a professor, my job is to make my students suffer. If they don't suffer, they're not going to learn anything. They're not going to benefit and be prepared for a future career. But if I'm a wise professor, I make sure the suffering is not so great that my students panic, or not so little that they don't benefit. Likewise, God temporarily is introducing us to exactly the right amount of suffering. And notice, he gives different suffering to different people, because he's created each one of us for a different purpose to fulfill. So we not all get exposed to the same suffering, but it's for our benefit. Yes?
All right, that's outstanding. Talk about suffering, because I'm going to bring up something that's going to cause some folks to suffer. Round earth, flat earth. Heliocentric? No, I'm serious. 4 years ago, pre-COVID, I thought if you would have mentioned flat earth, you were out of your freaking mind. I've spent 4 years looking into it. There's some merit there. So a heliocentric versus a Hebraic model of the earth. You haven't talked about that yet. In Genesis 1, it talks about the firmament over and over and over and over.
Yes.
And the sun in the firmament, the moon in the firmament, the stars within the firmament. So you've done a lot of study, obviously. Just kind of curious as to where you are on the Hebraic versus heliocentric model.
All three of the questions you asked me are covered in the book we're giving away, Rescuing Inerrancy.
You'll have it next week. We have time for one more question, and you are the winner.
Hi. That was a lot. Thank you. So forgive me if you touched on this. I was trying to follow. We've learned and sat under a lot of young Earth creation scientists. So my two questions that were coming up kind of together was the soft tissue that was found in dinosaur bones, and then the theory of all the fossils being laid down at once in one big catastrophic event. Example, Noah's flood, which is why we find, shark teeth on the top of mountains and all these things, because the whole earth was flooded. So I just was wondering if you could touch on that.
Well, I could. If you want a detailed answer, I just finished writing a book on Noah's flood. My wife is going to be editing it. It'll be released in about a year. But you'll find a lot of articles at reasons.org that answer your question. There's also 5 chapters in Navigating Genesis that deal with the flood. There's a reason why you find seashells on top of Mount Everest. The Himalayas are the result of the Indian subcontinent splitting off from Madagascar and rushing at a high velocity of 22 centimeters per year and crashing into Eurasia. The Himalayas are crumpled up seafloor. The seafloor between the Indian subcontinent and Asia got crumpled up to make the Himalayas. And even now, India is moving into Eurasia at 5 centimeters per year. So the Himalayas are getting taller and taller with every year that goes by. It's pushed up the Tibetan plateau, and all of this is essential to make human civilization possible. Now again, what I would share with my young earth friends, look to the Bible. Most of my young earth friends don't trust science, but they do trust the Bible. What does the Bible say about the flood? It's not just Genesis. There's more verses on the flood outside of Genesis than in Genesis. 2 Peter 2, the world of ungodly people was flooded. Were there ungodly people in Antarctica and Greenland? No. No need for God to flood Antarctica and Greenland. 2 Peter 3, the world that existed at that time was flooded. Peter is contrasting the world of Rome with the world of Noah. In both cases, it wasn't the whole planet. Or you go to Psalm 104, where it talks about the 6 days of creation. And where it speaks about day 3, that's verses 6, 7, and 8, where God creates continents for the first time. What does it say in verse 9? Now that we got continents, never again will water cover the whole face of the earth. So the principle I'm illustrating here, when you get into these kinds of debates, what is the Bible saying about end times? What is it saying about gender issues? What is it saying about the age of the earth or Noah's flood? Look at all 66 books of the Bible and interpret them all literally and consistently. That will help you resolve these controversies. And by the way, what I've learned is when you read church history, these are all things that are not in the creeds. It's amazing how Christians fight over stuff that's not in the creeds. They're not the essentials. And it was Paul who said, it's good that you have differences amongst one another. This is how you learn. I purposely hire scholars at Reasons to Believe that disagree with me, because this is how we actually are going to progress and to learn. But we're to disagree in a spirit of charity and love. And often that's missing on these issues. And it's not just the age of the earth. The gender issue is very divisive. Outside the Christian community, inside the Christian community. Let me close with this. What you see in 2 Corinthians 5, we're ambassadors. We who are followers of Jesus Christ are ambassadors, and we're calling people to make peace with God. But non-Christians watch us. They watch how we treat one another where we disagree. And if we're vicious, they're not going to trust us. But if they see us disagreeing in a spirit of charity and grace and humility, they're going to say, these are people I can go to. They will set me in the right direction. We all need to be ambassadors for Christ. Thank you.
Thanks, Hugh. Yeah, that was awesome.